What would make a veteran ICU nurse walk away from her dream job after just one night? Not burnout, not stress, something far worse. In a hospital built over a century ago, one room remained empty until the night a patient was placed there and everything changed. Alarms triggered with no one inside. Temperatures plummeted. Whispers echoed through the walls. What they uncovered behind the plaster wasn't just history. It was a buried truth waiting to be heard. This is that story. Riverview Medical Center wasn't like any hospital I'd worked in before. Built in 1876, it towered over the city like a relic from another time. Ornate stonework, arched windows, and ivy-covered walls gave it a kind of haunting beauty. But once inside, that beauty turned cold. The corridors were too quiet, the air too still. It felt less like a place of healing and more like a place time had forgotten. The ICU was located on the 4th floor, tucked away in the hospital's original wing. 12 private rooms surrounded a central nursing station. The layout was efficient, but something felt off. The walls seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Even the beeping of monitors was muffled. No laughter, no casual chatter, just silence. And then there was room 407. It looked identical to every other room, same bed, same monitor, same sterile smell, but no one ever used it. When I asked why, the day nurse, Linda Myers, hesitated. "It's just easier that way," she said, offering no further explanation. Later that evening, Dr. Jonathan Wells pulled me aside. "If we ever need to use room 407, he said, "there are protocols." He handed me a laminated card. It listed bizarre instructions. Equipment must be checked every 2 hours, even if the room is unoccupied. No one enters alone if there's an alarm, and a digital recorder must be placed inside the room at all times. I wanted to laugh, but he wasn't joking. The tension around that room was undeniable. Nurses walked past it faster. Techs avoided eye contact with the door, and even the air in the hallway outside felt colder. I didn't know what had happened in room 407, but I was beginning to understand why no one wanted to talk about it. At 11:15 p.m., everything changed. The ER called up with a last-minute transfer. David Keller, 52 years old, post-op from a routine gallbladder removal. He was stable, alert, and needed overnight monitoring. Normally, we would have assigned him to any open room, but the unit was full except for one. Room 407. I hesitated when Dr. Wells gave the order, but I reminded myself this was still a hospital. Rooms were just rooms. Ghost stories didn't belong in critical care. I prepped the room myself. The air inside felt heavier than anywhere else in the unit. Not musty, just dense. The kind of air that makes you want to take a breath and hold it. I checked the equipment, just like the protocol card instructed. Everything was working, but I had to double-check, and then check again. At 12:02 a.m., Mr. Keller arrived. He looked tired but calm. His vitals were good. We got him settled, adjusted his IV, ran his pain assessment, and did our charting. I asked the usual questions: any nausea, shortness of breath, dizziness. He answered clearly. But then his eyes drifted to the far corner of the room. "Is someone supposed to be in here?" he asked. "No," I replied, glancing around. "Why?" "There's a woman in the corner," he said, voice low but certain. "She's been standing there since you wheeled me in." I turned sharply. The corner was empty. "You're probably seeing shadows," I offered gently. "You're on medication. It's not uncommon to have vivid impressions." He shook his head slowly. "I'm a pharmacist. I know what morphine does. This isn't that." I stayed silent. Over the next hour, Mr. Keller grew increasingly anxious. He kept glancing at the same spot. At one point, he whispered, "She's not moving, but she's watching." At 1:23 a.m., I stepped out to round on another patient. When I returned 20 minutes later, I found him sitting upright, pale and sweating. "She's talking now," he said, "but I can't understand her." He pointed to the wall behind the bed. "She keeps pointing there." I followed his gaze. The wall was unremarkable except for a faint, square discoloration in the paint. A patch, maybe old repair work. I tried to redirect the conversation, but he stopped me. "Look at the thermostat," he said. It read 62 degrees. The system was set to 72. I checked the vent. It was pushing warm air, but the room still felt like a freezer. Then we both heard it. A soft tapping from inside the wall. 3 knocks, then silence, then again. Mr. Keller's voice dropped to a whisper. "It sounds like someone's trapped in there." I pressed the call button and paged Dr. Wells immediately. Something was deeply wrong with room 407. And for the first time that night, I realized this wasn't about superstition or fear of the unknown. Something or someone was trying to be heard. By the following evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in room 407 was unfinished. Dr. Wells must have sensed it too. He met me in the break room just after 10 p.m., a thick folder tucked under his arm. "I think it's time we stop ignoring what's right in front of us," he said. Inside the folder were reports, temperature anomalies, unexplained equipment failures, patient complaints dating back over 15 years. And one name came up more than any other: Grace Holloway. "She was a nurse here in 1918, he said, flipping to an old newspaper clipping. "Died during the Spanish flu, in room 407. The article was yellowed and brittle, but the photograph was clear. A young woman in a crisp white uniform, dark hair pulled back, eyes full of resolve. Grace Holloway, 28 years old, died while caring for influenza patients in the isolation ward, which, during the pandemic, had taken over the entire 4th floor. As we kept digging, the story grew darker. We found a letter from her sister, dated 6 months after Grace's death. It asked the hospital administration for the return of Grace's belongings, particularly her journal, which had gone missing. The letter went unanswered. More disturbing was a handwritten note from Dr. Edwin Hartley, chief of medicine at the time. It was addressed to the hospital board, recommending that room 407 be permanently sealed. The reason? He wrote that certain effects belonging to Miss Holloway contained personal observations and accusations which could jeopardize the institution's standing if misunderstood. Translation: Grace had documented something they wanted buried. At 11:30 p.m., Dr. Wells, respiratory therapist James Parker, nursing assistant Olivia Reyes, and I stood outside room 407. He'd gotten clearance from hospital maintenance. We brought tools, flashlights, gloves, and the recorder already running. The air was heavy again, colder than the rest of the unit. The monitor, though disconnected, blinked once. Then we began cutting. Layer by layer, drywall peeled away. Dust spilled to the floor in soft plumes. Behind the patched square, embedded inside the wall, we found a shallow cavity. And in that cavity, wrapped in brittle oiled cloth, was a wooden box. The moment Dr. Wells lifted it out, the room temperature began to rise. At the same time, the monitor flatlined again. Inside the box we found a leather-bound journal, cracked at the spine but still legible. A silver locket, tarnished but intact. A fountain pen, its nib rusted. And a folded envelope, sealed with wax. We opened the journal first. Grace had filled its pages with meticulous notes, times, dates, symptoms, observations. But it wasn't just about the flu. She wrote about unauthorized experiments being conducted on patients. She named Dr. Malcolm Morrison, a physician who had used the chaos of the pandemic to test unapproved treatments on vulnerable patients without consent, without oversight. Grace had tried to stop it. She had gathered evidence. She intended to send a complaint to the state medical board. The letter, included in the box, was addressed to them, dated the 14th of October, 1918, one day before her death. Her final journal entry read, "I fear I will not live to see this through. If something happens to me, may whoever finds this ensure the truth is told. The patients trusted us, and we betrayed them." We stood in silence. Dr. Wells placed the items carefully back in the box. "She wasn't haunting this place out of anger," he said softly. "She was trying to finish what she started." For over a century, Grace Holloway had waited, not for vengeance, but for someone to listen. Now, we finally had. The air in the room felt lighter after we removed the box, but none of us spoke for several long minutes. It wasn't fear that gripped us anymore. It was something heavier, like the weight of someone else's pain settling over our shoulders. Dr. Wells laid the box on a sterile tray and carefully opened Grace Holloway's journal again. The pages crackled as he turned them, each one filled with tight, deliberate handwriting. She had documented everything in painful, clinical detail. Grace hadn't just been a nurse, she had been a witness. And now, finally, she had become a whistleblower, albeit a century late. The entries began in September 1918, near the height of the Spanish flu pandemic. At the time, Riverview Medical Center had been overwhelmed. Patients filled the hallways. Supplies were scarce. Entire wings were turned into makeshift quarantine zones. The fourth floor, the same floor our ICU now occupied, had been designated as an isolation ward. Grace had been assigned there full-time. At first, her notes focused on patient care, vitals, symptoms, medication dosages. But by mid-September, her tone began to change. Today, Dr. Morrison administered a new serum to bed 12. Patient exhibited extreme fever spikes and vomiting within 2 hours. He assured me the reaction was normal. I am not so certain. Her concern escalated as more patients received the serum, labeled in her notes only as Compound M. She began cross-referencing symptoms, charting outcomes, and noting that most patients who received the compound died within 48 hours faster and more painfully than others. She confronted Dr. Malcolm Morrison, a senior physician who had risen to prominence during the pandemic. He dismissed her concerns and reminded her that no one questions protocols during wartime. His arrogance bled through her writing. She described him as brilliant but reckless, a man who saw the pandemic not as a crisis to be managed, but as an opportunity to experiment freely, without ethics boards or patient consent. He believes history will remember him as a pioneer, she wrote, but I fear it will forget the lives lost along the way. What shocked us most wasn't the experimentation. As horrific as it was, we knew at least academically that such abuses had occurred in the early 20th century. What chilled us was the level of intentional concealment. Grace's journal documented conversations she overheard between Dr. Morrison and Dr. Edwin Hartley, the hospital's chief of medicine at the time. According to her notes, Hartley knew about the experiments. He knew about the mounting deaths, and still, he allowed them to continue. Worse, he helped cover them up. Hartley instructed me to cease documentation, Grace wrote. He said my notes were disruptive, and that wartime medicine required sacrifice. I told him I would not be silenced. His eyes turned cold. He said, "Then I suggest you be very careful, Nurse Holloway." She wrote that entry on the 10th of October, 1918. On the 14th of October, she drafted her complaint to the State Medical Board, listing dates, patient names, symptoms, outcomes, and the involvement of both Morrison and Hartley. She didn't have access to a typewriter. She wrote it by hand, signed it, and sealed it in the envelope we now held in our hands. She never mailed it. Grace died the next day, the 15th of October, 1918. The official cause was listed as influenza, but as Dr. Wells read her final journal entry aloud, a horrifying possibility became undeniable. I awoke this morning with chills and burning lungs. I have not left the ward. I have not touched infected linens or patients without gloves. Dr. Morrison brought me tea last night. I had not asked for it. It tasted off. I fear this may be my final entry. The room fell silent. It wasn't just unethical experimentation. It was murder. Grace Holloway had been silenced deliberately. Her journal had been hidden in the wall. In room 407, her room was patched up like a forgotten scar. Dr. Wells flipped to a final, folded note tucked between the pages of the journal. It wasn't dated. It wasn't signed. But we knew it was Hartley's handwriting. It matched the memo we found earlier. In order to preserve the institution's reputation, the effects of Miss Holloway will be interred within the wall of her former patient room. Let her sacrifice be remembered privately, and let the hospital move forward without unnecessary scrutiny. No ceremony, no honor, just silence. Until now. As the clock ticked past 2 a.m., we all sat there, Emily, Dr. Wells, James, and Olivia staring at the physical proof of history's buried shame. It was more than just an old journal. It was testimony, evidence, a desperate nurse's attempt to do the right thing in a time when doing so could cost you everything. Dr. Wells broke the silence first. "She wasn't trying to haunt us," he said softly. "She was trying to be heard." That was when we all understood something else. Room 407 hadn't been haunted by a ghost. It had been haunted by unfinished business. Over the next few hours, we did what Grace never got the chance to do. We scanned the documents. We made copies. Dr. Wells called the hospital administrator, the current chief of staff, and scheduled an emergency meeting with the board of directors. We recorded statements, photographed everything. Grace's story was no longer a secret. At dawn, we placed her belongings back in room 407. Not hidden in a wall this time, but out in the open, on the windowsill where the morning light touched them. The silver locket, the journal, the sealed letter. We stood quietly, not as healthcare workers, but as witnesses. And as the sun rose through the tall, arched windows of the old hospital, something shifted. The cold was gone. The silence in the hall felt peaceful now, not oppressive. And when we left room 407 that morning, it no longer felt like a prison for lost voices. It felt like a memorial. By the time the hospital board convened 2 days later, the weight of Grace Holloway's story had already begun to ripple through the corridors of Riverview Medical Center. Dr. Wells and I presented everything: her journal, the letter to the state medical board, the original memo from Dr. Hartley, and the temperature logs and incident reports from the past 15 years. There was no denying what had happened. To their credit, the current board didn't attempt to suppress the truth. Instead, they listened, not just with professional curiosity, but with visible discomfort. One director, a retired physician herself, had tears in her eyes when she read Grace's final entry. Another, a man who had spent decades in healthcare administration, simply shook his head and whispered, "We failed her." The board voted unanimously to acknowledge the truth. The next step was up to us. It began with a ceremony. 3 weeks after we unearthed Grace's journal, Riverview Medical Center held a private memorial on the 4th floor. The staff who had worked in the ICU for years stood side by side with administrators, residents, and even a few medical students. A plaque was unveiled just outside room 407, the Grace Holloway Memorial Room, in honor of Nurse Grace Holloway, 1890-1918, who gave her life in service and spoke the truth when others would not. May her courage guide the future of ethical care. A table inside the room displayed her belongings: the leather journal, now sealed behind glass, the fountain pen, the tarnished locket, and a framed excerpt from her letter. The patients trusted us with their lives, and we betrayed that trust. There were no haunting chills that day, no shadows in the corners, just warmth and sunlight pouring in through the tall windows. It felt like the room was finally breathing again, but it didn't stop there. Dr. Wells worked with the hospital's ethics committee to create a new initiative, the Grace Holloway Foundation for Medical Ethics. Funded by both Riverview and private donors, the foundation would support whistleblowers in healthcare, fund research into patient advocacy, and sponsor educational seminars on ethical decision-making in medicine. One of the foundation's first programs was a recurring seminar series titled Voices from the Margins, When Speaking Up Saves Lives. Grace's story headlined the first session, and within months, nurses and medical professionals across the state were referencing her as a symbol of moral courage. The impact was immediate. Residents at Riverview began receiving additional training in patient consent, medical history, and ethical responsibility. Nurses were encouraged to bring forward concerns without fear. A new policy was implemented, requiring third-party review of any experimental treatment plans. Anonymous reporting tools were made accessible across all departments. And most importantly, room 407 was reopened, not as an empty, haunted chamber, but as a place of healing. I began spending more time there. Some of my colleagues still felt uneasy, stepping inside, the history lingering just beneath the surface. But for me, that room became a sanctuary, Not eerie, not silent, just peaceful. Patients assigned to the Grace Holloway Memorial Room often remarked on how well they slept. Many described it as comforting, or said they felt like someone was watching over them, but not in a threatening way. More like a quiet presence, keeping them safe. One elderly woman recovering from pneumonia told me, "There's a young nurse who checks on me at night. She never speaks, just nods. She always looks so calm." I never told her Grace's story. I didn't need to. What changed the most wasn't the room itself, but us. Before, nurses hesitated to question orders. We feared being labeled difficult, or worse, insubordinate. But after Grace, something shifted. Conversations became more open. Discussions about patient safety happened daily, without fear. Even the medical residents began asking more questions, not to challenge authority, but to understand. One night, a newly hired nurse pulled me aside and asked if the stories were true. "All of them," I said. "Did you ever see her?" she whispered. I paused, thinking of the time I stepped into room 407 during a night shift and felt a sudden calm wash over me, like someone had placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Not with my eyes," I said, "but I felt her presence. She's still here, but not trapped anymore, just watching." I also began sharing Grace's story with nursing students. Not as a ghost tale, but as a lesson in ethics, courage, and accountability. I'd bring the scanned pages of her journal into classrooms, project the entries on a screen, and read them aloud. The silence in those rooms was always profound. And then I'd ask, "What would you have done in her place?" Some students cried. Some grew angry. Others asked how many more Grace's history had forgotten. One student, a second-year med student named Brian, stayed behind after class. "Thank you for telling her story," he said. "It makes everything we're learning feel real." And that, I realized, was Grace's true legacy. Not the room, not the plaque, not the locket in a glass case, but the moral clarity she gave us all. The story eventually reached national circles. Medical journals published articles. Ethics boards cited her case. A documentary crew contacted Riverview for access. Grace's journal was scanned, archived, and requested by universities across the country. Some called her the silent whistleblower. Others labeled her the forgotten advocate. But to me, she was simply a nurse who saw wrong and chose to act. And that, more than anything, made her unforgettable. Sometimes I still walk past room 407 during night shifts. I pause for a moment, glance through the window, and whisper, "We hear you." Not because I expect an answer, but because some promises deserve to be spoken out loud. Grace Holloway didn't get to finish her fight, but by giving her voice a second life, we made sure the fight didn't end in silence. We made sure the walls could no longer hide what mattered most. Her journal ended with a call for truth. We answered it, and that, I believe, is what finally set her free. There's a before and after in every nurse's career. For me, the line was drawn by room 407. Before, I believed being a nurse was about competence, efficiency, clinical precision. I measured success by stable vitals, accurate charting, well-managed care plans. And honestly, that mindset served me well until I came face to face with a century-old truth that no textbook had prepared me for. After Grace Holloway, everything changed. In the weeks that followed the reopening of room 407 and the unveiling of her story, I found myself reevaluating everything I thought I knew about this profession. It wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about bearing witness, about ensuring that the voices of the vulnerable, especially the silenced ones, were never ignored again. Grace had been silenced for over 100 years, and somehow she'd still managed to reach us. That truth haunted me far more than the tapping in the walls or the temperature drops. Because if a nurse could be ignored for that long, what did that say about the system we worked in? About the people we trusted? About me? I started asking harder questions, and not just of others, of myself. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It came in small, steady shifts. I began spending more time at patients' bedsides, not just to assess their vitals, but to listen to their fears, their histories, their instincts. I stopped brushing off strange comments as delirium or medication side effects. I listened more closely when they said, "Something doesn't feel right." Grace had documented what she saw because no one else would. I realized that as nurses, we are often the first to see, and sometimes the only ones to care enough to document what others miss. I began journaling after each shift. Not clinical notes, real reflections. What went right? What felt off? What I regretted? What I wished I'd said. I started using my voice more during case discussions. I no longer let hierarchy keep me quiet. If something didn't make sense, I questioned it respectfully, but firmly. And something incredible happened. People listened. One morning after rounds, a junior resident approached me in the hallway. "I noticed you spoke up during the care plan meeting," he said. "You were right about that order. There was a miscalculation on the dose. I don't think I would have caught it in time." I smiled and nodded, but inside, I felt something deeper, a kind of confirmation. Speaking up hadn't always felt safe, but now it felt essential. I no longer feared being labeled difficult. I feared what would happen if I wasn't. That's what Grace had taught me. I also found myself pulled into the education side of nursing. Dr. Wells invited me to co-lead a seminar on ethical advocacy. Standing in front of a group of fresh-faced nursing students and telling Grace's story was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Not because the story itself was too dark, but because it was true, and that made it heavy. At the end of the session, a young woman raised her hand. "How do we make sure we don't become the kind of nurse who looks the other way?" she asked. The room went quiet. I answered slowly, carefully. "You stay close to your instincts. You trust your gut, even when it's inconvenient. You document everything. And when the time comes, because it will, you choose to do what's right over what's easy." Her eyes didn't leave mine. She nodded. That's when I knew Grace's legacy wasn't buried in a wall anymore. It was alive in us. Back in the unit, I started noticing the changes ripple outward. Nurses supported one another more. We double-checked charts without offense. We shared concerns without shame. We had honest conversations about burnout, patient care, and moral distress. The ICU didn't become perfect overnight, but it became safer for patients and for staff. And room 407? It became the most requested room in the unit. Families asked for it without knowing why. Patients reported having restful sleep, vivid dreams of comfort, or simply a sense of peace they couldn't explain. One terminal patient, a retired school teacher named Helen, told me, "I feel like someone is watching over me here. Not in a scary way, more like I'm not alone." She died quietly in her sleep, hand in mine. I remember brushing her hair back, the early light warming the room, and whispering, "Thank you, Grace." I also changed outside of work. I spoke differently, slower, more thoughtful. I no longer rushed through conversations. I paid closer attention to people's tone, their body language, the unspoken things. My relationships deepened both with my patients and with the people in my life. I volunteered to mentor new hires, especially those fresh out of nursing school. And I made it a point to tell them, "You are the eyes and ears of your patients. Your words carry weight. Never underestimate what you know, and never be afraid to speak it." Some took the advice lightly, some clung to it like a lifeline. But either way, I gave them what Grace had never received validation. I often wonder how different her story would have been if just one person had listened to her when she was alive. If someone had believed her, backed her, protected her, would she have lived? I can't change what happened to Grace, but I can honor her sacrifice by making sure it doesn't happen again, not on my shift. The ICU is still a place of urgency, of life and death, and split-second decisions. But now, for me, it's also sacred. Every time I enter room 407, I pause. I acknowledge her, sometimes silently, sometimes aloud. Just a small gesture, but one that keeps her memory active. Because Grace Holloway isn't just part of the hospital's past. She's part of my future. Some nights, when the unit is quiet and the machines hum in rhythm, I sit by the window of room 407 and write in my journal the way she did, not to document wrongdoing, but to remember, to stay grounded, to remind myself that the heart of nursing isn't just care, it's courage. Grace showed me that, and because of her, I became a better nurse, a better listener, a better human being. I didn't just survive my first night in the ICU. I was reborn by it. People often ask me if I really believe in ghosts. After everything I've seen, it's a fair question. But I don't think Grace Holloway was ever a ghost, not in the traditional sense. She wasn't here to haunt or to frighten. She was here to be heard, to be acknowledged. Her spirit lingered, not because she was angry, but because the truth she carried had been buried along with her. And the truth has a way of demanding to be found. For over a century, her story was hidden behind drywall and silence. But even in death, she remained steadfast. The whispers, the cold, the knocks from the wall, they weren't random. They were purposeful, urgent. They were the last, desperate efforts of someone who knew that justice, no matter how delayed, was still worth seeking. And when we finally listened, everything changed. The darkest thing I witnessed during my first night in the ICU wasn't an apparition or flickering lights. It wasn't the cold air or the shadows in the corner. It was the realization that people in positions of trust had knowingly harmed the vulnerable and then buried the evidence. But in that darkness, I also saw something radiant. I saw the power of a single voice. A nurse, silenced by fear and betrayal, who refused to stay silent even after death. I saw what happens when we dare to confront the past, to peel back the layers of secrecy, and to finally look at what's been hidden in plain sight. Grace Holloway's legacy lives on not just in a plaque on the wall or a glass case in a memorial room. It lives in every nurse who chooses to speak up, every doctor who double-checks an order, every hospital policy rewritten to protect patients instead of reputations. She reminds us that truth is resilient. It may be silenced, it may be buried, but it is never lost. And when it resurfaces, no matter how long it takes, it brings with it the power to heal, to change, to set things right. That's the lesson I carry with me now. In every chart I write, every voice I listen to, and every room I enter, I remember her. Because sometimes, the most powerful hauntings come not from the dead themselves, but from the truths we refuse to face. Until we finally do,